Presentation of dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Coming up, he may not be a household name, but the programs he created are. A conversation with Jac Venza, the founder of iconic PBS shows like Great Performances, Live from Lincoln Center, and Dance in America. Dialogue is next. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. My guest today is a pioneer in television. Jac Venza has worked in the medium since the 1950s and is directly responsible for the development of arts programming on PBS. He was the maestro behind Great Performances, Live from Lincoln Center, Dance in America, and dozens of other programs. His shows won 11 Primetime Emmys, and until 2010, he held the record for Emmy nominations, 57. For his accomplishments, he's been awarded a Primetime Emmy for Lifetime Achievement, a personal Peabody Award, and PBS's highest honor, the Ralph Lowell Award. Now retired, the 85-year-old Venza spoke in Moscow recently at the invitation of the University of Idaho's College of Art and Architecture. At our studio on the campus there, I was able to sit down and talk with him about his long career in the arts and television. Where did this love of art and performance come from?
It was the visual side. I always, since I was maybe 10 or 11 in Chicago Park District things, wanted to be a designer for the theater. Once I was in one of the shows, I decided I didn't want to be an actor, but I would join the company if they would let me work on the scenery and backstage. And so by the time I was in high school, I determined I wanted to go out and study to become a professional designer for the theater. What I didn't know is that by the time I got into the union to be a legitimate person, the best place to get a job is not sit around and wait for a Broadway show, but this new thing called television. So I started as a pioneer, as a designer, a visual designer.
So it wasn't necessarily in your family. It was.
No, my father was a shoemaker, and when I was shining shoes at the age of 10 or 11, then they said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" I didn't say fireman. I said I wanted to be an artist. I don't know why, but that's what I would say.
Very interesting. Now, often art is considered elite, and yet that's obviously not where you came from and not your point of view about it.
Wait, that's a very important point. Since I came from a family with no access to the arts, very, very poor family. My father was a shoemaker. We lived in space behind the store. And because I knew that I wanted to be an artist and began in little theaters to see other people, I realized that in the young people interested in the arts in Chicago before I came to New York, they had come from farms in Idaho. They all somehow, their interest to be a painter, to be a dancer, someone came from so that's why I knew that if we were going to have an audience, that was a big audience and it was out there, and that we should just do the best possible thing, because I knew that this kind of audiences were out there were not the people with high education necessarily, but people had another hunger.
Now, when you started in television, as you said, it was kind of a blank slate. It was what we might call new media today.
Absolutely.
Television was new media then. What was the gap that you saw in programming that made you gravitate towards arts? Because, of course, there had been programs with performers on them.
Well, the first opportunity was I started at CBS as a designer in 1950. And what was wonderful about it, and terrifying at the same time, is nobody knew much about anything. I was very young, which was very good to have energy and sort of the audacity. And I realized when there was an opportunity as a designer to influence the whole program and where it might go, I was willing to talk up. And usually I was luckily successful about what I would propose. So I became
talk up meaning saying I can do this, or let's invite a big person.
Or that's not a good idea, sir.
Speak up.
I have a feeling that maybe this would be a better idea. Not to always be, but to become. So I was soon moved from the design department into the producing department, and I also realized that when this idea of another kind of television came up that was not commercial, that almost all the things I did in New York on my own, going to the ballet, going to the things at the museums and those lectures in the arts, etc., none of that was ever part of my daily life in broadcasting. So when people said, what is this other thing? I said, boy, there's a lot of stuff that we can do.
Meaning the other thing being the embryonic PBS, which was known then as NET. National
Educational Television. Mm-hmm. And I stumbled on it simply because I had so many friends. I was working on a very unusual show for CBS in those years out of the Museum of Natural History. And because it was not, again, a commercial show, but went to be sort of one of their necessary educational programs in each week, we did half hour at the Museum of Natural History, and I suddenly thought, wait a minute, I've just had lunch with one of the world's great paleontologists, or this fantastic anthropologist like Margaret Mead. What we talked about that would be possible for next week's show was a lot more interesting and provocative than what Patty Page's next number was going to be next week, which is what we generally did at a production meeting. And that was when I began to get the idea that you could be in this broadcast service where the intellectual and artistic level could be upped nearer to the things I was going to in my personal life as an artist.
And the Ford Foundation, right, was critical in the initial funding of NET and then PBS. All of this excitement and everything doesn't mean TV was a blank slate, but you didn't have a blank check. I mean, you had to pay for putting these ideas together. So if you had an idea to put a ballet on, how did you pay for it?
Remember, I worked for CBS and Network, so when you needed production, you simply got those departments together in a room, the design department here, the prop people, the makeup in here, and you sort of ordered up what you needed and you budgeted. So now I went to this NET station that the Ford Foundation supported, and it was the endeavor was important because it said, we're trying to get this bill through Congress, which became PBS, but there were a number of stations around the country already set up with education, very much like this station in the building that we're in. And they had taken already an initiative on the fact, other than television as a device to sell cigarettes or breakfast cereal, we should use the media in another broader sense. So those stations numbered almost about 40 of them. And Ford said, you know, our effort with Omnibus, a beautiful program in the arts on CBS, was a beautiful program. We showed how the arts could look on television, but the ratings were terrible. And so the network considered it artistically great as a network broadcast a failure. So Ford said, wait a minute, maybe we would do better if we want to make it moving over to this non-commercial thing. So they needed some programs for the stations for prime time. The stations were generally doing more academic things. So they hired a group of us as professionals, almost all of us were from CBS, we all knew each other, for this experiment to start to provide some nighttime programming. And when we sat as a group, most of the people who had come from public affairs wanted to be Edward R. Murrow, who had died and left a fabulous legacy of what you could do with public affairs. And I was the only one who said, aren't we going to do anything that's entertaining? They said, what do you mean, Jack? I said, well, though I came from public affairs, you got to remember, I started in the entertainment part of it. Aren't we going to have any like singing and dancing and music? And they said, well, what are you talking about? Look at the budget. How can you do that? I said, I don't know how, but I think we better. I don't think we should have a whole broadcast service that has nothing that's really entertainment. They said, okay, that's your problem. You deal with that. We're going to go back to our documentaries. And then I sat there, and I had a sort of young gal in a very hippie costume and a telephone and nothing else. But I had over 10 years of experience working my way through those early as how to do anything. And I realized with that telephone, I couldn't make contact with all those other people. Remember, we were still live system. We did not yet have very sophisticated editing. So it was important to have that that much experience under your belt.
So you were able to call potential funders that way too for money, or in the early days was it mostly funded through the government?
There's a very important moment. I began to look at the budgets that we had, and I began to start to put together programs we could do that were much more simpler. And very often I would take them up to Boston GBH, which had, in those days, the best station in the system. And the price was better. And we had to talk to the unions about reconsidering what payment for a system with no audience was, etc. So a lot of pioneer work in just laying out with all the professional unions what we're about. And I would
to reduce their rates.
Yes, but you had to say to them, we can't pay network rates. We need another kind of rate, and we need another usage. They said, what do you mean? I said, well, the problem that nothing is repeated on television is everyone has to pay complete rates again. We need at least 3 or 4. They said, what do you mean? I said, you've got to remember we're going to feed it to stations through the mail. And when they get it, they may want to run it 2 or 3 times, once in the evening, once in school hours. And so that was one of the problems. But
you have always believed that money should not be the denominator or the reason that somebody does not do a project.
I'll tell you what happened. We were in a meeting. Now I wanted to move into more ambitious dramas with some of the nonprofit theaters. And I was doing budgets about what travel, what the move, changing the scenery, things. And there was a woman that I didn't know sitting in one of the meetings when I was trying to convince management what I would like to do. And at the end of the meeting, she said, Mr. Venza, I want to introduce myself. And I said, yes. She said, you know, don't change your goal. Tell me how much you're missing and tell me, and I'll find it. And I said, oh, and I said, who is he? She says, well, she's in development. I said, what is development? She said, well, it means fundraising. And I said, I mean, and she said, yes, beyond the Ford grant, there are other places we can get money. There's other foundations. And she was the one that then said, could you do that presentation you did about theater in America for Exxon? And that was my first encounter with trying to convince people in industry how what we were doing, this quality. Luckily, at that time, they had a vice president in charge of public relations who thought this was a great idea and went with us finally when we expanded it to great performances.
Now, another part of your philosophy was that you were not afraid to also pick up the phone and call some of the biggest names, you know, whether that was Leonard Bernstein or Edward Albee, and ask them to do television.
See, one reason that I was emboldened is I knew that really the finest playwrights, the most important choreographers, Martha Graham, Balanchine, etc., were never of interest to the network. Even people like our important jazz artists were considered too special interest for the networks, and particularly by then. Because when this activity was starting, almost all of the production in prime time had moved to 35 mil around the West Coast. So the liveness of even the music program, the vibe programs had all disappeared. There was almost no music on at all. So I knew that those artists had not really had much celebration of television, but I knew also they'd never been approached to do what they really cared about doing themselves. Seems so simple, doesn't it? To
do what they love to do and do it well.
Yes.
They'd always been told what to do.
They were usually asked to say, yeah, could you do a 15-minute thing for the Bell Telephone Hour program or something like that? And I knew that because I had been on the other side. In the meantime, I was going to their concerts of their work, and I thought, really, no one has ever asked them to do what they want to do. So I started with a very important premise that was very different. I would go to them and say, we're starting this new media. If you were to put something together, what would you like most to see? Well, no one ever asked them that. So they were already drawn into the dialogue. And that was the big change.
Now, you mentioned Balanchine in that list of people, and some people needed a little bit more coaxing to get into television, and he was one of them. And I actually had a question from one of our viewers in Boise who danced with Balanchine and wrote in on our Facebook page. And he also danced in both Dance in America and Live from Lincoln Center. This is a man named Afshin. He said, I just need to know, what was it like working with Balanchine and the New York City Ballet?
Well, I'll tell you what, because Balanchine was one of the people, in order to get some more money for his dancers, because they were being paid very minimally at New York City Ballet, he had some experiences where they went on to do a 5 or 10 minute thing. And it was live. Things were blocked very haphazardly. When they did because it was all done in one day, when they finally did the dress, he just hated the way the cameras had been placed. It seemed all wrong for the choreography, but there was no time to tell anyone anything, because they were told to get their makeup freshened up in a half hour. We're going live.
This is before he met you. This is
so I observed what had happened to those people. So he did not want to talk to us. And I came up with another piece of new equipment. By then we could record things, for one thing. We didn't have to be live. We could record in segments, so people's energy and makeup could be adjusted. We're doing close-ups, etc. And when I went to him, I said, I have a very simple idea, Mr. Balanchine. Let's take time in the studio, before there's all the camera equipment and all that stuff, with our little handheld camera, the kind you do with for your kid's birthday party. And we'll sit here with our camera, and we'll show you where we think the camera, and you do a phrase, and then we'll put it up, and you come over and discuss with us, did you like where the camera was? Because there were several things we could do. One was we could add 1 or 2 cuts, or you could change the shape of the thing. No cut, I changed choreography. So by the time we got into the studio, he and the dancers were all drawn into it in a way they had never had in the media before. And the word went out very fast. Boy, this Venza's dance experience was so different. One of my biggest things was, I at least thought we should also have a room to warm up. So when they were warm, they could go into this damn cold studio and make sure they had proper stuff to eat, just simple things no one ever thought about before.
And a wooden floor to dance on instead of
most importantly, concrete. Most studios, so the cameras don't wobble, have concrete like this one. That is the last thing in the world a ballet dancer wants to be on point and do it with leaps and hit concrete. So we made a special floor with consultation from 3 ballet companies to make sure that the floor had the spring and the size. So those were the things they had never had before.
You worked with huge egos in the artistic world. That's not necessarily a bad thing. You need ego to have these come off the ground. But it sounds like one of the ways that you worked with them was just simply giving them some control over the product.
It is true. One of the most important things is to think about their comfort zone.
Yeah.
If you're working with Leonard Bernstein, he's more concerned about the music than anything else. And I thought, well, this is how we'll start. Let's find out who does his recordings, and let's ask if they would line up to do the audio for our videotape. So we could say, so that meant automatically he knew that there was someone he trusted dealing with the music. Then we could go on to how it was going to look.
So you would deduce what the needs were of all these different people and help meet them. Now, did you ever care about ratings? Because we hear this constant sense that, people don't like the arts. The ratings for the programs are low. Did that, when you thought about a particular program, did that concern you?
This goes back to, remember you asked about background, and I said that my father was a shoemaker. We had no arts in our family anywhere. But my first friends all came from those backgrounds. So I knew whatever people said about ratings, that out there in this audience that we had to reach, there was the person whose life we could change because they could see there was an alternative. And my feeling particularly was in the broad sense of education. If someone is in a school and everyone is doing rock and roll and they like something else, wouldn't it be good for them to see the best version of it? And that was the important and that was what the National Endowment of the Arts felt about dance in America. They said, you know, dance is blossoming around the country, but we can't take our best companies and tour them everywhere. It's so costly. But if we took some of the endowment money and invested them to let you make a really beautiful program of Balanchine or Martha Graham. And we could put it on the air free so that anyone in this country could see it. I could go to Congress and say, give us the money here and we'll get the arts to everyone in your constituencies, because the people who sit there in Congress and check off whether they're going to support the National Endowment of the Arts come from also on the states, and they want to know what of this money is going to come to them.
You also took some risks in unknown actors and performers. There's a young Dustin Hoffman in one of your pieces, a young Meryl Streep, and you discovered people, you discovered talent and promoted it.
What I learned very, very early on, if you were going to work, for instance, with one of the top theater companies, and you say, this was a wonderful program, this wonderful drama, I wanted to do a translation of it for television, because they had rehearsed it for months. They had beautiful performances in place. And then you said, but I'd like to replace the leading actor with so-and-so, who was going to be available 2 days to fill in. It automatically dismisses my real interest in them and their work. So I took the position that if we're going to work with those companies, we had, and as it was, Meryl Streep, Dustin Hoffman, they were all beginning their careers.
Mm-hmm. You had to be creative because there wasn't a lot of money. So you went into joint ventures with European stations such as the BBC.
I'll tell you
when it came to music rights for a musical, you couldn't buy the rights to the whole musical, so you made a documentary about the making of the musical. You know, all things that seem kind of normal now, but they weren't then. You had to be creative.
I'll tell you what most people don't realize. We started a very vibrant television based on radio, but remember, all of broadcasting was really in the hands of advertising as a base. There were exceptions. The Public Affairs Department, they did a few token arts programs a year. But the fact was, that isn't the way broadcasting in the other world. I had gone a lot to England where you saw the BBC, which was supported by everyone going to the post office and paying their part of it. So their broadcasting was very broad. The Channel 1 did the popular things, Channel 2 did this, these symphonies were on Channel 3, and those programs had world-class people, Olivier to people doing Uncle Vanya. So I thought to myself, I wonder if we could, as one way to expand, if I could go and buy some of those programs so we could expand the amount of drama we produced, because they were very high quality. And they also did something that never was being done by the networks, and that was they did wonderful dramatizations of literature. And what began then, just in the last couple of weeks, are these beautiful Dickens programs that have been on Masterpiece Theater. But it was also a way of, we said, how are you going to fund? Well, that's one way, is to go into co-production. Begin to look at the international scene.
We're rapidly running out of time, but I would be remiss on the funding issue if I did not ask you about the latest news, which is that the NEA is significantly down in the funding that it's receiving from Congress. And as a result, programs like Great Performances, instead of getting $400,000, right now are projected to only receive $50,000. How will this drop in NEA funding, along with, I assume, a drop in corporate funding for some programs, affect these shows?
The reason it concerns me very much is that I'm afraid if we are diminishing what we're going to do, a whole generation of people will go to what's being streamed to them, which may not have as much quality or much thoughtfulness about it. And they're going to begin to settle for another kind of material than that it was not curated in the way we used to do the arts in our documentaries and our art form. I think they'll begin to look for what comes easy on their media streaming. and not really expect anything better, because what's happening now is what could be done cheaply, quickly.
Mm-hmm. So we might see fewer great performances. Do you think the series and the other series might go away?
Well, one of the biggest problems is going to be, I think, that people funding, and that's part of the challenge for the endowment of the arts, is they would like to move some of their money from television to the other media. But if you diminish it much further, not one of the media is going to be healthy by the amount of money that Congress gives. We were funded so poorly. If you looked at the funding in the first days of public television by government, and you looked at what BBC got, you can't believe we still exist today.
As we wrap up, and I look forward to talking with you in our Web Extra more about some of these issues, you've always been known as a person to spot trends and to jump on them. If you were still in charge of these productions and money was not the issue, what kind of trend are you seeing now in the performing arts that would make you want to go out and do a program on it? What's exciting to you now?
I think one of the interesting things right now is how many live performances already involve media in their performances. In the Museum of Modern Art the other day, there was a modern music group who collaborated with visual artists, and there were productions behind. So we would be looking at how media is being used and think, now how do we translate that into television, where the media has already been part of the creative process.
Interesting.
And that's where we're going to have another kind of program where the mixed media is being laid on the creating of the art, and we'll be mainly just using television to transmit it, to get it to the broad audience.
And finally, you're here to talk to students as well. What do you want to say to them?
What I want to say to them is, I think this. They're going to be going through what I did in 1950 when I came into a new media. As you go into that mass media that they're in now, they've got to be very conscious of what they individually want to do. And if they are ambitious in any of these areas that I was, and they target an artist of some distinction and want to collaborate with them, spend some time listening to that person before you impose your thing on them, if that's the kind of collaboration you want. And sometimes collaboration with someone who's already been proved to be very distinctive is a good place to learn a step in a direction you never thought you would do yourself.
Thank you so much.
I enjoyed being here, really did.
You've been listening to Jac Venza, the founder of some of the most famous arts programs on television, including great performances, Live from Lincoln Center and Dance in America. I'd like to thank the College of Art and Architecture at the University of Idaho and the staff of KUID, our station in Moscow, for making this interview possible. And check out our website for a special Web Extra I taped with Mr. Venza, in which we discuss his experiences with cultural giants like George Balanchine and Leonard Bernstein. I'm Marcia Franklin. Thanks for tuning in to Dialogue.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho. Check out our website, become a friend on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter.